Every rapper you've ever listened to signed a piece of paper, every single one. From the biggest names on the planet to the underground artists grinding for their first check. At some point in their career, they sat down at a table, picked up a pen, and signed their name on a document that they were told would change their life. And it did change their life, just not in the way they were promised. Because the music industry doesn't make deals. The music industry sets traps. Elaborate, meticulously engineered, legally bulletproof traps disguised as opportunities. And the bait, the advance check, the marketing budget, the promise of fame and fortune and everything you've ever dreamed of is so intoxicating, so overwhelming, so perfectly calibrated to appeal to a young person with nothing that most artists don't read what they're signing. They don't understand what they're agreeing to. They don't comprehend the scope of what they're surrendering until it's too late to take it back. And even the ones who do read it, even the ones who hire lawyers, who ask questions, who push back on the most obviously predatory clauses, even they don't know about the other terms, the unwritten terms, the terms that aren't in the contract because putting them in writing would be criminal, the terms that are communicated not through legal language but through implication, through pressure, through the slow, suffocating realization that the deal you're being offered comes with conditions that nobody mentioned during the pitch meeting. Curtis 50 Cent Jackson knows about those terms, not because he read about them, because he lived them, because he watched them destroy people he cared about, because he spent 30 years inside a machine that he now has the power, the platform, and the willingness to describe in detail that no active artist would dare provide. And what he's describing, in a series of interviews, podcast appearances, and private conversations that have made their way to the public, is a system so predatory, so dehumanizing, and so deliberately designed to exploit vulnerable young people that it makes the financial exploitation look like the least of their problems. The financial terms are bad. The unwritten terms are worse. And the terms that nobody talks about, the ones that exist in the silence between the clauses, in the spaces between the words, in the looks exchanged across the table when the young artist isn't paying attention, those terms are something else entirely. 50 Cent is talking about all of it, every level, every layer, every disturbing, uncomfortable, infuriating detail. Before we get to the disturbing stuff, before we get to the things that 50 says happen off the page, we need to establish how bad the written terms already are, because the contracts themselves, the actual legal documents that artists sign, are already so exploitative that any other industry would consider them unconscionable. 50 laid this out in a recent interview with a clarity that comes from decades of experience on both sides of the table, as the artist who got exploited and as the executive who watched the exploitation happen to others. He said, "The standard record deal, the one they put in front of a kid from the projects who has never seen a lawyer, never read a contract, never had anyone explain to him what in perpetuity means, that deal is designed to do one thing. Take everything, not some, everything. Your music, your name, your image, your likeness, your future, everything you create, everything you are, everything you might become. It belongs to them, not for a few years, forever." 50 broke down the standard terms that most new artists encounter, and even the basics are staggering. The advance, the number that makes the young artist's eyes go wide. 50,000, 100,000, 250,000. Numbers that, to someone who grew up with nothing, feel like infinity. And the label presents the advance as a gift, as an investment in your talent, as proof that they believe in you. But the advance is not a gift, it's a loan that has to be paid back, not out of the label's revenue, but out of the artist's share. Every dollar of that advance is deducted from the artist's royalties before the artist sees a penny of profit. And the royalty rate, the percentage of revenue that the artist is entitled to, is typically between 12 and 20%, 12 to 20% of the revenue generated by their own music. 50 said, "Do the math, you get $100,000 advance. Your royalty rate is 15%. That means for every dollar your music generates, you get 15 cents. And out of those 15 cents, the label takes back the advance. So your music has to generate approximately $667,000 before you see $1 of profit, your first dollar. And that's before they deduct recording costs, marketing costs, video costs, tour support, all of which come out of your share, not the label's." He shook his head. A kid who can't do long division is signing a deal that requires graduate-level financial literacy to understand. And the people across the table know that. They're counting on it. The confusion is the feature, not the bug. 50 then moved to the evolution of the standard record deal into something even more predatory, the 360 deal, and his description of how 360 deals work should be required listening for every young artist in America. He said, "The old deals were bad enough. They took your music, but at least your touring revenue was yours. Your merchandise was yours. Your endorsement deals were yours. The label took the records and you kept everything else. It wasn't fair, but there were boundaries." The 360 deal erased the boundaries. The 360 deal says, we don't just own your music, we own a percentage of everything. Your tours, your merch, your endorsements, your acting career, your clothing line, your liquor brand, your podcast. Everything you do that generates revenue, we get a cut. Not because we contributed to those things, not because we helped you build those things, because you signed a piece of paper that says we're entitled to a percentage of your existence. 50 described the logic that labels use to justify 360 deals. They argue that because the label is investing in developing the artist's brand through marketing, promotion, and exposure, they deserve to participate in all revenue streams that benefit from that brand development. That sounds reasonable, 50 said, until you realize what they're actually saying. They're saying that because they promoted your album, which is their job, which is what they're supposed to do, which is the basic function of a record label. They now own a piece of your entire life. It's like your employer saying, we trained you, so we own a percentage of everything you'll ever earn, even after you leave this company. In any other industry, that would be called indentured servitude. In the music industry, it's called a standard deal. And 50 pointed out something that most people don't consider. The artists who sign 360 deals are almost always young, almost always from disadvantaged backgrounds, almost always without legal representation that matches the sophistication of the label's legal team, and almost always so desperate for the opportunity, so hungry for the chance to escape their circumstances, that they would sign virtually anything put in front of them. That's not a negotiation, 50 said. That's a mugging. You're taking a person whose options are sign this and maybe become somebody, or don't sign this and go back to nothing. That's not a choice. That's coercion with a pen instead of a weapon. This is where 50's breakdown moves from financially predatory to personally invasive, because the contracts don't just take your money and your music, they take you. 50 described a clause that appears in virtually every major label contract, sometimes explicitly, sometimes buried in language so dense that it takes a specialized entertainment attorney to identify it. The image and likeness clause, he said. Most artists don't understand what they're signing when they agree to the image and likeness clause. They think it means the label can use their photo for marketing, their face on an album cover, their name in a press release, standard stuff. That's not what it means. What it means, what the actual legal language grants the label, is ownership of your image, your face, your name, your voice, your persona, not just for marketing purposes, for any purpose, in perpetuity. The label can use your likeness to promote products you don't endorse, can license your image to companies you've never heard of, can create content using your face without your involvement or approval, can, in some contracts, prevent you from using your own image in ways that compete with their interests. 50 described a situation he witnessed personally, without naming the artist, where a label exercised its image clause to prevent an artist from launching a personal brand. The artist wanted to start a clothing line using his own name. The label's legal team sent a cease and desist letter arguing that the artist's name and likeness were contractual property of the label, and that using them for a non-label affiliated business venture constituted a breach. This man couldn't use his own name, 50 said, his birth name, the name his mother gave him. He couldn't put it on a t-shirt without the label's permission, because he signed a piece of paper when he was 19 years old that gave them ownership of something that should be unownable, his identity. He continued, and here's what keeps me up at night. Those clauses survive the deal, even after the contract expires, even after the artist is dropped, even after the relationship is over. The label retains rights to the image and likeness for the duration specified in the contract, which, in many cases, is forever. You can leave the label, you can never make another song for them, but they still own a piece of who you are, legally, permanently. Now we get into the territory that 50 says most people don't know about, the clauses that don't govern business. They govern behavior. 50 said, there are clauses in these contracts that control how you live, not how you make music, how you live, who you can be seen with, where you can go, what you can say publicly, what political positions you can take, what social causes you can support. what relationships you can have. He described what the industry calls morality clauses and conduct provisions. On the surface, these clauses appear reasonable. The label has invested in an artist's brand, and behavior that damages the brand damages the investment. Standard business protection. But 50 says the application of these clauses goes far beyond brand protection. I've seen contracts where the morality clause gives the label the right to terminate the deal and recoup all advances if the artist engages in behavior that the label deems detrimental to the artist's commercial viability. That language is intentionally vague, because vague language gives the label maximum flexibility to interpret it however they want. He gave examples. An artist speaks out against the label's parent company on social media, detrimental to commercial viability. An artist supports a political cause that the label's corporate partners find controversial, detrimental to commercial viability. An artist refuses to participate in a promotional campaign that they find morally objectionable, detrimental to commercial viability. The morality clause isn't about morality, it's about control. It's a leash, a legal mechanism that allows the label to punish any behavior that doesn't serve their interests. And the punishment isn't just termination, it's recoupment. They cancel your deal and they demand their money back. So you're not just fired, you're fired and in debt for hundreds of thousands of dollars, sometimes millions. 50 said, that's how they keep artists quiet, not through threats, through math. The math of knowing that if you say the wrong thing, support the wrong cause, date the wrong person, go to the wrong party, if you do anything that the label decides is detrimental, you lose everything, your deal, your advance, your career, and you leave the label owing them more money than you'll ever be able to repay. That's not a contract. That's a cage. Everything I've described so far is on paper. It's in the contracts. It's legally documented, legally enforceable, and, while exploitative, technically legal. But 50 says the written terms are just the foundation. The real architecture of control is built on the unwritten terms, the expectations that are communicated not through legal language, but through culture, through pressure, and through the implicit understanding that refusing to comply means the machine stops working for you and starts working against you. 50 said, there are things you're expected to do as a signed artist that will never appear in any contract, because putting them in writing would create evidence. And the people who run this industry are too smart to create evidence of what they really expect from you. He described a system of unwritten obligations that escalate as the artist's profile grows. At the lowest level, the obligations are relatively benign. Attending certain events, being seen with certain people, participating in certain industry rituals that serve the label's networking and relationship-building purposes. But as the artist becomes more valuable, as the streams increase, as the cultural influence grows, as the artist becomes a genuine asset rather than a speculative investment, the unwritten expectations intensify. You're expected to be available, 50 said, not for studio sessions, not for meetings, available as a person. Your time stops belonging to you. Your schedule stops being your own. You go where they tell you to go. You show up where they tell you to show up. You sit next to who they tell you to sit next to at the dinner. You smile for the photos they tell you to smile for. You are, in every meaningful sense, their property, and they treat you accordingly. He continued. And the consequences of refusing? They're never stated directly. Nobody says, if you don't show up to this dinner, we'll shelve your album. They don't have to say it, because you've seen what happens to the artists who don't comply. The album gets delayed. The single doesn't get pushed to radio. The marketing budget gets redirected. The features fall through. The opportunities dry up, not because anyone made a phone call, because the machine simply stops moving for you. And in an industry where momentum is everything, where a 3-month delay can kill a career, the machine stopping is a death sentence. 50 introduced a concept that he calls the access economy. And this concept is the key to understanding why the unwritten terms are so much more insidious than the written ones. He said, in the music industry, the real currency isn't money, it's access. Access to the right people, access to the right rooms, access to the information that determines who gets the opportunity and who doesn't. Money can buy a lot of things, studio time, producers, marketing, but money can't buy access. Access is granted by the people who control the gates, and those people don't grant access for free. 50 described a system in which access to the highest levels of the industry, the executives who greenlight projects, the playlist curators who determine streaming success, the media gatekeepers who control cultural narrative, is contingent on compliance. Not financial compliance, personal compliance, willingness to be available, willingness to participate, willingness to do what is asked without questioning why it's being asked. The access economy is the reason artists do things that don't make sense from the outside, 50 said. You see a rapper show up at an event that has nothing to do with music and you think, why is he there? He's there because he was told to be there, because being there is the price of access, because the person who invited him controls something he needs, a playlist spot, a feature, a cosign, and the invitation wasn't a request, it was an invoice. He continued, and the access economy escalates. The first ask is small, show up here, be seen there, take a meeting with this person. The second ask is bigger, travel here, spend the weekend at this location, attend this private gathering. Each ask is slightly more demanding than the last. Each one pushes the boundary a little further. And by the time the asks become truly unreasonable, by the time the artist is being told to do things that violate their personal boundaries, their values, their sense of self, they're too deep in to refuse, because refusing means losing the access. And losing the access means losing the career. 50 paused. It's grooming. That's what it is. I know that word is loaded. I know it carries connotations that make people uncomfortable, but I'm using it deliberately because it's accurate. The system grooms artists the same way predators groom victims. Start small, build trust, normalize incremental boundary violations, create dependency, and by the time the real violation occurs, the victim is so embedded in the system that resistance feels impossible. 50 addressed the topic that everyone has been circling since the Diddy indictments, the private gatherings, the parties, the events that happen behind closed doors, off the record, away from cameras, the events where the unwritten terms are communicated most clearly and enforced most ruthlessly. He said, everybody wants to talk about the parties now that the indictments are public, now that the evidence is coming out, now that it's safe to say what everybody knew for decades. But where were these conversations 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago? He continued, I'll tell you where they were. They were happening in whispers, in private, between artists who had been to the gatherings and come back different. Artists who wouldn't talk about what happened, but whose behavior afterward told you everything you needed to know. The drinking got heavier, the drug use escalated, the music got darker, the interviews got shorter. Something happened to them at those gatherings, something that changed them. And the industry's response was to manage the symptoms, rehab, therapy, medication, without ever addressing the cause. 50 described the gatherings not as spontaneous parties, but as structured events with specific purposes. Networking events where access was traded, showcases where new artists were presented to power brokers, and, at the highest levels, private sessions where the unwritten terms were made explicit. The young artist walks into the room thinking it's a party, 50 said, thinking it's an opportunity to meet the right people, make the right connections, advance the career. And it is all of those things. But it's also an audition, an evaluation. The people running the gathering are watching. Who drinks and who doesn't, who's comfortable and who isn't, who's willing to go along and who pushes back. They're sorting, identifying, deciding who is compliant enough to be advanced to the next level and who is too independent to be trusted. He said, the artists who pass the audition, who demonstrate the right combination of talent and compliance, they get the next opportunity. The bigger deal, the better positioning, the access to the rooms that matter. The artists who don't pass, who show too much independence, too much self-awareness, too many boundaries, they get nothing. They get shelved, they get buried, and they never know why. They just know that the phone stopped ringing. 50 named several artists, without naming them, who he says attempted to push back against the unwritten terms and paid the price. He described an artist who was on the verge of a massive breakout, debut album performing well, radio support in place, tour being planned, who was invited to a private gathering and declined. No reason given, just, I'm not going. Within 2 weeks, 50 said, the radio support disappeared. The tour budget was cut. The label stopped returning his manager's calls. 6 months later, the artist was dropped. No explanation, no conversation, just a letter from the legal department informing him that the label was exercising its option to terminate. And the termination clause, buried on page 47 of a 60-page contract, included recoupment of all advances. The kid owed the label $300,000 for the privilege of being destroyed. He described another artist who attended a gathering, witnessed things that disturbed him, and attempted to speak publicly about what he saw. Before his interview aired, the label's legal team contacted the outlet and threatened threatened litigation. The interview was killed. The artist was summoned to a meeting at the label's offices. And in that meeting, which 50 says he heard about from someone who was present, the artist was told, in calm, professional terms, that his contract contained a confidentiality clause that prohibited him from discussing internal label events and activities. Any violation of that clause would result in termination, recoupment, and a lawsuit for breach of contract. The confidentiality clause, 50 said, that's the lock on the cage. You can't talk about what they do because talking about what they do is a contractual violation. They built the silence into the deal, literally, legally. They made silence a contractual obligation, and any artist who breaks that silence doesn't just lose their career. They lose their money, their home, their future. Everything the advance paid for gets taken back. That's why nobody talks. Not because they're afraid of violence, although some of them are, because they're afraid of the bill that comes due the moment they open their mouth. 50 then did something he rarely does. He got personal, genuinely personal. Not the calculated vulnerability of a media appearance, the real kind, the kind that costs something to share. He said, I'm going to tell you something I've never said publicly before, because I think it matters, and because the young artists who are watching this need to hear it from someone who's been there. He continued, when I first got into the industry, before Get Rich or Die Trying, before the Eminem cosign, before any of it, I was in rooms, the rooms I'm describing. I was invited to gatherings. I was presented with the unwritten terms, and I want you to understand something about what that experience is like for a young man from Southside Jamaica, Queens, who has nothing, who has been shot 9 times and survived, who has lost people, who has seen things that most Americans can't imagine. When you come from that background and someone offers you everything, the deal, the money, the fame, the future, and all you have to do is comply, the temptation is overwhelming because compliance feels small in the moment. It feels like a minor concession, a temporary compromise. You tell yourself, I'll do this one thing and then I'm in. And once I'm in, I'll have the power to do it my way. That's what you tell yourself. He paused. But it doesn't work like that, because the first compliance leads to the second, and the second leads to the third. And by the time you realize that the concessions aren't temporary, that they're permanent, that each one is a link in a chain that gets heavier with every addition, you're already too deep. You've already done things. You've already been to places. You've already been seen with people. And the system has documentation, not legal documentation, evidence, photos, videos, records of your presence, records of your compliance, records that can be used to ensure your continued cooperation. 50 said, I was lucky. I was lucky because my background in the streets, the violence, the survival, gave me an instinct that most young artists don't have. The instinct that says, this feels like a setup. The instinct that says, the person offering you everything wants something that costs more than money. I recognized the pattern because I'd seen it before. Different context, same dynamic. Someone with power offering something to someone without power, and the price being something that isn't named until it's too late. I said no, and the cost of saying no was my first deal. Columbia dropped me. My career was dead before it started, and I spent years in the wilderness, years of being blackballed, years of being shut out, years of watching less talented artists get pushed because they said yes and I said no. But I was alive. I was free. I was still me. And when M found me, when the second chance came, I came into it on my terms, not theirs. And that's why I've been able to do what I've done. Not because I'm the most talented, because I'm one of the few who never gave them leverage, never gave them the compliance they could hold over me, never gave them the documentation that keeps other artists silent. That's what I want young artists to understand. The cost of saying no is real. It's painful. It might end your career before it starts, but the cost of saying yes is permanent. It follows you forever. It becomes the leash that they hold for the rest of your life. And no amount of money, no amount of fame, no amount of success is worth being on someone else's leash. 50 concluded his remarks by connecting everything he's described to the broader project he's been building, the documentary, The Machine, the project that he says will lay bare the full scope of the industry's exploitation, from the financial terms to the unwritten terms to the terms that nobody talks about. He said, everything I've told you today is the introduction, the overview, the executive summary. The documentary goes deeper. The documentary has names, has faces, has artists sitting in front of a camera, finally freed from their confidentiality clauses, because NDAs don't survive criminal investigations, and the investigations that are happening right now are making a lot of paperwork unenforceable, telling the world what was done to them. He continued, I've been collecting testimony for over a year. Artists, producers, managers, lawyers, accountants, people from every level of the industry who have seen the machine from the inside and are ready to describe it in detail. Some of them are names you know. Some of them are names you've never heard, but their stories are consistent, disturbingly consistent. The same patterns, the same tactics, the same terms, across labels, across decades, across genres. The machine doesn't change. It just finds new operators. 50 said, the Diddy situation opened the door, but Diddy is not the machine. Diddy is a product of the machine. One operator among many, one node in a network that spans the entire industry. And the documentary isn't about one person. It's about the system that creates the terms, that enforces the terms, that punishes the artist who refuse the terms and rewards the artist who accept them. And I want every executive, every gatekeeper, every person who has ever sat across a table from a desperate young artist and presented them with terms that no informed, empowered person would accept. I want every single one of them to know that the documentary is coming, that the testimony is recorded, that the evidence is secured, and that the era of silence is over. He said, the machine has been running for decades, grinding up young people and turning them into content, into revenue, into assets to be managed and discarded. And the machine kept running because nobody with a platform big enough to matter was willing to describe it publicly. I have the platform, I have the evidence, and I have something that the machine can't buy, can't threaten, and can't take away. The willingness to say it out loud.